morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. Thank you so very much for joining us. I am here with Andrew McLuhan. Thank you so very much, Andrew. Really great to meet you finally after all the years of watching your dad's work and seeing what you're doing with the Institute. For those of you who don't know, and I just talked to a couple people who don't, Marshall McLuhan is a famous media prognosticator. I don't know how to futurist. He's so many things that your dad did, and you're continuing in his tradition. And so, could you just tell everyone a little bit about the McLuhan Institute better than I'm able to do?
Hey Chris, it's a pleasure to meet you, and hello out there, whoever's watching or listening, wherever and whenever you are. Yeah, I'm Andrew McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan was my grandfather.
Oh,
His son Eric McLuhan was my father. So I'm the son of Marshall McLuhan, and I created the McLuhan Institute essentially because it didn't exist. Marshall had something called the Center for Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto back in the 60s and 70s, but it didn't survive him. It died a little while before he did, and though it reopened, it certainly was never the same. And my father wasn't able to create something to outlive him either, other than myself. So I wanted to take this tradition out of biology and into the world and create somewhere that would continue their work in their tradition, making their methods and discoveries available and accessible. And here we are.
awesome, awesome. Thank you so very much for agreeing to join me. As we were discussing a little bit before we started here, we've been working deeply around human-centered AI and what it's going to take to enable our society to thrive by augmenting human work instead of replacing it. There's a whole bunch of interesting work that the Pope Leo's been doing. Of course, Pope Leo chose that name because the last Pope Leo came about during the rise of the industrial era and fought a lot of the industrialization, trying to find that balance because it was seen through religious perspectives as the dignity in human work itself, the actual work, whether it's digging a ditch or producing a television program, whatever that might be. And so that really creates some very interesting times that we're in right now, and we are blessed to live in these interesting times, are we not? I try to keep reminding myself of that. But we've been working on specifically this idea of an H Corp. Now, that's not a B Corp type thing, although a human-centered corporation, which is what we mean, could be a B Corp. And I believe anyone who commits to this sort of framework that we're trying to develop, that we haven't figured out completely yet, is going to be a public benefit corporation, whether or not they get certified. But where we've landed is that we want to identify the principles, policies, and practices that define a human centered organization. And so I'd love to explore a couple of those different areas with you and figure out what your perspective might be on what a human organization might look like that would commit to human flourishing and human labor as a part of what they're doing instead of AI based replacement.
Sure. This is a big question. And of course, the Irish toast, "May you live in interesting times," was always a mixed kind of wish, wasn't it? They say that, such times are better seen through history than through the present. But um, this is a great. I think we're near, we're along the way of a process that began a long time ago, which was a lot of our institutions, like corporations, are artifacts of a previous age, the industrial era, really. You mentioned the first Leo. When all these kind of things came about because of what was happening in the world, in people at the time, the world and us humans were being reshaped by new technologies, um, machine technologies, which were all about splitting things apart and fragmenting them, and certainly not human-centered. Uh, to reimagine corporations now makes a lot of sense given the kinds of technologies and the environment that we live in. It's kind of interesting that it hasn't happened really sooner. It speaks to the power of the residual kind of forms and structures. But we've come to a point where it's, I think, unavoidable and inevitable one way or another. The great thing is that we have a chance to shape that in certain ways and to ask questions like, what does human-centered mean? Um, you know, of the utmost consequences to answer the question, what does human flourishing mean? You
Mm,
because it might mean different things to different people. And it also means different things depending on your perspective. As a bit of a student of history, um, I understand that uh, different ages have different kind of ideals. What's important to somebody in this age is different than what's important to somebody, well, even 20, 30 years ago. I was talking to somebody this morning who was born in 2002, and so grew up with the internet, you know. And I can remember a time when we didn't have phones in our pockets and couldn't put everything online. And thank God too, because, some things are best left unsaid.
yes.
But the age that we're in that forms us gives us certain ideals. It makes us into a certain somebody. It gives us a certain culture. And these big changes throw all that out the window. And so to talk about no human left behind is a worthwhile thing to ask. It's also worth to ask is can these cultures, can these values persist in the age of AI? And critically, if we can figure out what our values are, can we figure out a way to have them carry forward? Because
Mm,
one thing that we've learned through all the various disruptions you'd mentioned before coming through, the 70s and computing and internet and how these overturned culture and work. Um, is there a way to do that with minimal kind of disruption? These are questions we need to ask, and now is the time to ask them.
yeah. So, given your study of history, um, I'm curious if there has been any technology revolution that we intentionally chose as broadly, as opposed to an individual, where we chose how we wanted to transform instead of being transformed by the technology. Because I believe that's a fundamental problem
Yeah,
we have.
it is because I put out a tweet which I've pinned to my page that you're not designing a product, you're engineering culture. Um, because the two things aren't necessarily compatible. And we have very, very few examples of people consciously choosing society or culture over technology. Uh, but we do have them. And they're in things like, not to oversimplify, but some Amish communities, for example. They realize that they have a way of life that is not compatible with a society that's growing up around it. And so they take steps, extreme steps, to wall them off from it. But the difficult, that can work in limited situations, and it can work to an extent. The problem, the problem we're faced today is one of speed and scale, of pace. In times gone by, change happened slowly and you could adapt. It took centuries for the printing press to go around the world and work its way everywhere. Today it happens overnight. Overnight, you get millions of active users in a new chat GPT version or something like this, right? So we don't have the time to adjust. Um, and the other thing is, we can't simply say, well, I'm not going to you know, one of my favorite exchanges was W.H. Auden and Marshall McLuhan debating television. And Auden, the poet and playwright, said to McLuhan, I don't have a television and I wouldn't dream of having one, right? To which McLuhan responded, well, you merely suffer the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits.
Mm,
Because the point is, you can say only the most privileged among us could not have a smartphone. Because it has worked itself so much into the way we do things that you're at a real loss if you don't have one. You might not have a smartphone, but your assistant does and does everything for you, right? So how do we take that in effect? Um, how do we build in opting out? Can we build in opting out? The other thing that I think about being a word person and a poet, I think a lot about what has for most of human history been the state of language, which is oral. It's wild to consider that the written word is fairly new in the time scale of things. For most of human history, all culture, all knowledge was transmitted from mouth to ear. Um, and because of that, that gave constraints on things. We can afford to do things because we can write things down that we couldn't before. One of the challenges I give my students is to compose a poem completely orally. You can't write it down, and you have to be able to recite it the next day, or it doesn't
Mm,
count. And it becomes very clear how impossible it is for us to do that. But consider something like the Odyssey, which is hundreds of typed pages, took hours, if not days, to recite, right? And that was done completely orally. The differences between the two societies couldn't be greater. And this is the kind of difference we're looking at when we move to AI, because among other things, it's completely revolutionizing what language means to us.
I'm really grateful for your historical perspective on this and reminding me of these things. It's very poignant and helpful. Thank you. I want to get back into the start of where I believe, and this is what you're getting at. I believe underlying all this, and it gets down to the values
Yeah.
that we embrace and issue.
Yep.
And again, the first thing that I believe is a principle for a human centric organization is to actually value humanity, to value their people. And of
Yeah.
course, for what the entire industrial era, people have been saying, well, maybe not in the early days of the industrial era, but at least the last 50 years, people have been saying that our people are our most valuable assets, or our most valuable assets walk out the door every night, and these sorts of things. And of course, in most cases, it's paying lip service to it, because
Yeah.
really the most valuable asset is the quarterly report of whether or not we met our targets or beat them, and how our stock performs, for the
Mhm.
large part. So that's what happens when we get to scale,
Yeah.
versus, as you were talking about with the Amish community, when we have localized values that we're able to embrace within a community of peers who are within physical proximity to one another, as opposed to distance through the medium, as we are doing here now through this screen. So, what other sorts of values, besides just valuing our own humanity, our prana, our ability to hold and hug each other, to serve each other, to be in community together, what other
Yeah.
sorts of things do you believe an organization should value to support human flourishing?
Well, I think we can't talk about human flourishing without talking about human scale. And there must be some kind of formula which, relates meaning and value with scale. Um, I live in a small town. Actually, I live between farms. I'm out here in the country. But the towns around me are small towns of, 500, 4,000 people is the largest. And at that kind of scale, you have a daily existence that is different from the kind of scale when you live in a big city or even a suburb. Um, they're quite different things. And, I think what we value is what happens mainly in the off hours, right? At home with our families, out with our friends, if we're lucky, with our colleagues. But usually that's a function of scale as well. Small companies, small teams. I think there's a sweet spot of scale, something like Dunbar's number, which talks about the amount of human relationships you can manage, right? While keeping some kind of meaning to it. That all comes into play here. It turns out that human flourishing is hard to scale. But does that mean that that's a problem that we can't account for and solve? And I'm not sure it is. In fact, I think one of the main benefits of AI might be the fact that it's so encyclopedic and can spot the kinds of patterns that are very difficult from us to see at the granular level. Those are the kind of strengths I think it has. To take massive amounts of data, like, for example, what does human flourishing mean to most humans on the planet? you know, because that's kind of where we have to start if we're gonna build toward it, right? But again, human scale, and it's easy to illustrate the difference when you think about traveling, right? The very different experience between walking somewhere, riding a bicycle, driving somewhere, and flying somewhere, right? Flying there is going to get you there faster. I'm not walking to San Francisco from Toronto. Um, but people go on road trips rather than fly for very good reason, and that's the quality of experience, you
Mm,
know. And that's what our life is about. When it comes down to it, when you're looking back, you're not remembering the flight to San Francisco. You're remembering the week and what happened along the way. And I think that's what people prize about experience and our lives. And that's, I think, what the Amish, to use an oversimplification, are getting at when they make their kind of decisions, because they realize that their way of life doesn't scale.
mm. You know, in the early days of social media, as we started developing automatic posting tools and even just scheduling, forget even, the rest of it, but automated response systems and things like that.
Yeah.
I had briefly owned a domain, humansdon'tscale.com,
Nice.
um, because I was trying to explain, and that's a very personal experience. Because as I went from working with a small group of people to San Francisco to working with people around the world, I started noticing the drain on my own personal energy
Yeah.
and on what it took to actually interact with more people and how draining that can be. It's incredibly energizing, but it also at the end of it, the battery has been surged up and the battery surges down. So anyway,
Yeah.
I completely agree with you, and we've got to find that. But the way you frame that is so helpful. I hope for many more people. Obviously, I could keep talking to you about this. There's so many more things, but I want to be respectful of your time this morning. Any closing thoughts before we go ahead and just wrap up here for today on this subject?
You know, when I talk about this idea of going someplace and the different ways to travel, and the different levels of experience, I also relate it to words because I'm a word guy. But I invite people to reflect on, not just the quality of experience and getting from one place to another, but the form of the word too. Because you know, we speak at around 200 words a minute. I type at about 80 words a minute. I write by hand at about 40 words per minute. And
Mm,
these different speeds of word are very tied to your speed of thought. And the speed of thought is very much tied to the quality of thought and the nature of conversation and writing and output. And we don't know what's happening with the word right now and what this change in freeing the word from humans for the first time and giving it over to kind of algorithm and machine is going to do. But I think about this a lot, and it matters to me. But there's what you mentioned about human. My father's website has a bookshop, and to order a book or a magazine or whatever from it, you actually have to email somebody. You can't click a button and it just automatically sends. And because of this friction, I've met so many interesting people around the world over the last years that even if I could automate that, I wouldn't.
mm. I really appreciate and love that so much. Um, Andrew, there's so many more things I want to talk about, and I hope we get to continue to do that over the years ahead as we all embark on protecting the word, protecting our souls, and ensuring the survival of our society. I hate to always have to frame it in those terms, but I don't believe people really realize yet how much it is. But good news, the reason why we're having this conversation is because there is a broader awakening. It's not just a couple of people who understand what's happening and what could happen, but it's also a wider conversation as people are impacted already by the adoption of AI across society. And I hope that together we're able to shift this just a little bit, and perhaps even more greatly. And I really appreciate your time this morning. Andrew McLuhan, McLuhan Institute. What's the URL again, just so we can share it, make sure everyone gets it?
Well, it's the McLuhaninstitute.com. or tmitm.com. And you know what? I agree. I don't think we've been in a better position to do something about it. So here's to talking more.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking with me and all of our friends this morning. Have a great day, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Take care.